Hey friends, it's Mal. Welcome back to the Witch Church podcast if you're listening, and welcome back to my YouTube channel if you're watching. So you may have heard a rumor that I'm doing a tarot class again, my tarot class called Tarot for Personal Transformation, and it starts really soon, May 23rd, 2023. This is my fifth time, I think, teaching this course, and I'm super excited to welcome in this new cohort, which is the Emperor cohort. And every single one of my tarot classes has a sort of, I guess we could say, like the spirit card of the cohort, and that card tends to show up in ways that we didn't even expect. So it'll be interesting to see how the Emperor shows up with this cohort. But regardless of that singular card, Tarot for Personal Transformation is a tarot class that will change your life, will teach you the cards in a really meaningful way that is unique to you. We kind of get you out of guidebook mode and instead get you into storytelling mode, which I think is a really beautiful way to learn tarot. And yeah, it's just a fun class. You'll meet your tarot crew. We meet live on Zoom, but you can join from anywhere. You can watch the recordings if you miss a class. That being said, in light of my tarot class coming up on May 23rd, the details are going to be in the show notes. I really wanted to have like a tarot reader discussion, because I usually do that. I usually try to release some sort of special tarot episode, kind of hand in hand with the release of my class, right? And I was like, okay, what could we do for a tarot episode? And I have been following Jessi Huntenburg for years now. She's actually been on the Witch Church podcast way back, I think in 2020. I think my podcast still might have been called Horoscope Witch. I don't know at this point. But you may also be familiar with Jessi. She's a tarot reader, witchy YouTube queen. But actually it's funny because just from the outside looking in, as someone, again, who follows Jessi's content, I've been watching her sort of evolve, and her sort of content has really changed, I think, in a really great way. And it seems like she's showing up in a really different way than she used to. And on top of that, she's in the process of creating a tarot deck called the Genius Garden Tarot. So I was like, all right, this is perfect. I wanted to have Jessi on. We're going to talk about the tarot deck creation process, but also at the root of what I wanted to talk to Jessi about is how we can transform ourselves as content creators, and also how that transformation in itself may sort of change our listenership, how it might change the number of views we're getting, how certain people might relate more to like the shadowy sort of darker content. And you'll see how Jessi speaks to how her content has evolved a little bit more into the light, and you know, how that's sort of affected her follower base. And it's just a really interesting interview. If you are a content creator or a tarot reader, or you're just marketing your services somehow to the world, Jessi and I really get at this sort of theme that every single content creator will go through, which is, I'm going through a transformation, but my fan base still likes my old self, you know? So how do I introduce this new version of me to my fan base? And what happens if I lose people along the way? And what happens if I gain different people too that didn't find me before? So again, that public, dealing with that public idea of transformation feels really juicy. So that's sort of why I titled this episode Out of the Shadows and Into the Light, right? So one more thing before we hop into the interview. I definitely want to read Jessi's updated bio, but I also wanted to say that Jessi's Kickstarter for the Genius Garden Tarot is running through May 9th, 2023. So if you're listening to this right as this episode's being released, you still have time to join in on the Kickstarter. You can see the pictures of the cards on Jessi's YouTube, the tarot deck website, which I'll have below. Also, Jessi's Instagram features the cards, and they're like really, really beautiful. And I love the concept of the Genius Garden Tarot too. And I'm going to tell you more about it here. So, Jessi Huntenburg is an artist, writer, tarot reader who lives in Philadelphia. She creates offerings that evoke your genius, that glorious, creative, divine thing that's unique to you. After dedicating the past 8 years of her career to teaching tarot cards, witchcraft, and transformative ritual, she's finally plucked up the courage to plunge into the wild and wonderful world of self-publishing. Her first tarot deck, the Genius Garden Tarot, will be released this fall. Again, don't miss out on the Kickstarter if you're listening in a timely fashion. And if you do find this, if you find this interview way in the future, let's say the deck has already been published and it's out into the world, I'm sure the links below will still lead you to supporting that deck somehow. And if you've never just stumbled upon Jessi's content before, it's a great moment to do so. So without further ado, let's hop into the interview and we can listen to how both Jessi and I have kind of dealt with our inner transformations publicly and what that's been like. Okay, enjoy the interview, guys. Jessi, welcome back to the Witch Church podcast. We haven't had you on since I think 2020, so it's been a second, and I'm so looking forward to getting like the life update and all of the juicy gossip from you and all of that. But I will say I've been following your content for a really long time. Like even when I considered myself a baby witch, baby tarot reader, you were one of the first people that I found on YouTube and I really connected with. And lately, I've been noticing like such a shift in your content. And quite frankly, it seems lighter and it seems more filled with like joy and pleasure and nature, which is so interesting because when I first found you, it was very shadow worky. I remember specifically following some of your Morrigan content where you were working with this like dark shadow goddess, and I was like, wow, this Scorpio's intense, you know. So what it's kind of bringing up for me is like, you know, as witches, as tarot readers, we're constantly saying the word transformation. But then when it comes to our own transformation, it's kind of hard to grapple with. So I'm wondering, like, what has it been like? It kind of seems like you're not doing a 180, but there's for sure a huge difference between the content you were putting out versus now. I know I'm not asking you a specific question, but I just wanted to say, like, wow, like there's a transformation here.
Indeed. And it's very challenging. There's so much I could say about this. I think I'm just gonna start and see where it goes. It is very challenging to share your spiritual practice publicly.
Yes.
And to offer tools and resources to others that are very geared towards a specific manifestation of spirituality or spiritual practice or a particular approach, and to have your own journey lead you somewhere different and then continue to kind of engage and share in that way that's not necessarily reflective or resonant of where you are on the journey any longer. There is a huge dissonance there's huge dissonance in that. And it's something that kind of comes on slowly. And then the gap widens as you continue to grow and shift and change. And what it is that you are offering publicly doesn't necessarily reflect where you personally are on the spiritual journey. So when I began doing this, like you said, you found me in 2018, which was, pretty early. I started with a YouTube channel and a blog almost at the exact same time, sometime in early 2016. I know that I launched my tarot reading business in June of 2016. So I've been doing this for quite a while. And when I started offering resources in blog form and on YouTube, I was very much engaged on my own shadow work journey. I was in the shadow. I remember also saying a couple times in a couple videos that like I live in the darkness, and that's kind of very much how I felt. And I wanted to know and to understand that darkness more fully. And that's really what shadow work is. Shadow work being spearheaded by Jung and being this process of shining a light on our unconscious or our subconscious and trying to bring forth some of those things about ourselves that are hidden in shame. And so we can understand them and integrate them and become a fully formed, fully integrated being. And really what that means, like everyone's like, what does it mean to be integrated? What it really means is to accept your shadow, and to, kind of reclaim those parts of yourself that you have distanced yourself from because you're ashamed of them, because maybe you don't like them, because maybe even realistically, they're aspects of your personality that are antisocial, that cause problems, that may actually be harmful to other people as well as to yourself. So it's no mystery to me why the shadow is in shadow, because some of these aspects of self are really challenging to deal with. And, they show us in our deep complexity, and they show us that, yeah, you're not perfect. Yes, you also have these tendencies, or even you have the propensity to do great harm to yourself and others in the world. So a lot of times we'll push these propensities away from us because we don't want to recognize them. And shadow work is shining a light on this, looking at these aspects of selves and reincorporating it and say, yeah, I'm not perfect. Yeah, sometimes I don't always act and show up in a way that's beneficial to myself and other people. Maybe I'm not always self-loving. Maybe I'm not always compassionate. Maybe I'm not always all of these things that we would so desire to be. So I dove deeply into my shadow work journey. It was helped by working with, like you said, the dark goddess Morrigan, and really like embracing that energy. And I found that working with the dark goddess was instrumental in helping me to kind of accept and recognize those aspects of myself that I'd hidden in shadow. And it was an amazing experience working with the dark goddess Morrigan. And I worked with her for probably 4 years, pretty intensely. And then tarot was also a practice for me that I used to learn more about my shadow, about those repressed aspects of self. And this went on for quite some time. And I kind of almost switched my focus from offering resources about tarot specifically to offering resources about that concerning transformative ritual, working with dark goddess energy. I came to tarot before I came to witchcraft, but not much longer before. There wasn't really that. It was like a couple months gap, I'd say. And through doing this work and offering this work, I found that I was really helping a lot of people too. I was sharing a lot about my own shadow, sharing a lot about my own journey, and also helping guide others on their journey through tarot readings and sessions, and then what became e-courses. And there was more of a focus on shadow, and there was also more of a focus on witchcraft, magic, paganism as modalities through which we could kind of do this work. And it was about 2 years. It's about 2 years ago. It was about 3 years ago where I started feeling a shift, an inner shift. And I can speak to it now because I have a certain clarity as to what was going on, but at the time I didn't really know what was going on. I ended up like kind of falling away from the Morrigan specifically. I think that's how it started, where I didn't feel like working with that. I didn't feel the same connection to that deity. And to anyone who's worked with deity very consciously and very intensely, this can kind of be a little bit devastating because it's a relationship you develop regardless of your paradigm, regardless of whether you think that this is an actual spiritual entity that exists, or if you think it's like, an aspect of your unconscious, regardless, losing that kind of relationship can be really challenging. And it can also be really confusing when it's not really necessarily something that you asked for. It just kind of began slowly but surely to fall away. So that was like my first indication that things were shifting and changing. My second indication that things were shifting and changing is that it became harder for me to offer tarot readings to others. And this is very complex. And I think everyone experiences this differently. I think when I first started reading tarot, I was very much approaching it from the perspective of the wounded healer. And I think that I was kind of receiving healing through offering tarot readings, and that there was like a dynamic happening there. And I felt deeply engaged with that work and felt like I could offer that in a way that was very supportive. But I started to feel, because I was at this point, I was doing many, many readings every month. And I started to feel that I was no longer the best person to do this particular work, which was also completely destabilizing. So first, the relationship with the matron falls away. And now the work that I've been doing that I really feel has been a great service to others is falling away as a calling, as like a central calling. So that was weird and confusing.
Yeah.
And eventually the modalities that we specifically associate with witchcraft began to fall away as well. I just began to practice them less frequently. And so this was I don't think that this was anything that I orchestrated on purpose. I think it was just an outcropping of where I was going on the spiritual journey. And honestly, the more that I integrated my shadow and the more that I kind of healed, the less I felt called to engage in these specific ways, which was very destabilizing. So there was a period, and I honestly think that as I'm finishing the creation of the Genius Garden Tarot, which is a tarot deck that I've been working on for the past year, it feels almost like, the world in tarot. There's a sense of completion. This journey that began, this journey of change and transformation that began is, it's coming to completion through the completion of this specific creative output. And in this time, I've just had to kind of like do a complete 180. And it's been very hard because in this liminal space, I didn't necessarily know where I was going. And it's one thing to do that on the personal journey. Okay. It's one thing to be in liminality in private. It's another thing to be in liminality when who it is that you are publicly is very much fused with modalities, services, and practices that you are deeply associated with and that everyone has come to you specifically for. I was just like, what am I going to do? Like, it's like, not only is like my spirituality changing, but like the way I show up in the world publicly and the business that I've owned and that I've cultivated over years is going to have to change because of this. And I don't know if anyone's going to be left at the end of this journey. I might have to sacrifice my public, the way I show, my business. I don't even know what to call it, but like this thing I've been building in public for others is something that might not survive the chopping block of this process.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I relate so much to like this story of being in the shadow and then realizing the shadow work is getting out of the shadow
Mhm.
in a weird way. And I think as people who practice some sort of witchcraft, magic, whatever we want to call it. Now I'm leaning more towards just like nature worship as my
Mhm.
witchcraft practice.
Likewise.
Yes, and there's something there too though about like how much of the shadow are we engaging in and how are we engaging with it? And something that kind of just sparks my intuition from what you've said is that um misery loves company. And not that I'm saying you were miserable when you were making the shadow work content, that's not it. But like you said, you were living in the darkness, and potentially some of your followers, probably even me at some point, was really attracted to like, ooh, this like scorpionic witch who is doing all this shadow work. And like, I want to go into my shadow and I want to, kind of be in that space, which there's nothing wrong with that at all. I think
Oh no.
all of us almost have to go on that journey at some point in our spiritual sort of evolution. But then when you, as the practitioner, or as the witch, or as the content creator, start to, let's say, emerge from the shadow, and then you feel like, oh, wait, I have these followers who loved when I was in the shadow. So now that I'm presenting a completely different thing, will those people follow me, or will they just say, oh, you've changed or whatever? Which, by the way, I think is a fear that us content creators have. Like one of our followers commenting on a YouTube video that's like, wow, you changed. Or like, and we're like, well, all I talk about is personal transformation. And then what if I'm demonized for changing?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really challenging. And I have to say a lot of people did fall away. And I don't even blame them because what it is that I'm offering now, the tone is so different. Um, so people who are in the midst of, deep shadow and a shadow working journey probably aren't going to resonate with some of the things that I'm saying. And, we go in cycle, like we move in cycles too, like we move in and out of cycles of shadow. So, but I think sometimes the way that we interact and engage with shadow changes over time. Um, if we're really trying to integrate, if we're really trying to integrate the light and dark sides of ourselves, and eventually we're going to come to this place of kind of harmony between the two. There's going to be a less extreme vacillation. Like it's not going to be like all joy or all darkness. It kind of moves in and out of each other in a more balanced way. But we can also go through these cycles where we go from dark to light to dark to light. And I mean, reminiscent of the phases of the moon, for example. We wax and we wane, but on the spiritual journey, we kind of come, we try to get closer to a space of balance. And this is also something that I've discovered too. Right now, we're very much living in a time of extremes. So when you come to a space of balance, um, there's also, and the ego gets can get trapped. But when you come to a space of balance, this is not true across the board, but I'm seeing this right now. There's going to be less people there to hear about the balance. At least that's where I have arrived right now. And that could just be because of where I came from, if that makes any sense. Um,
Oh, yeah.
there's more, I mean, you can even look in terms of algorithms, there's more attention for extreme viewpoints, or for even just like focusing on the extreme end of a pole, like the polar spectrum, than there is for that middle space. or that middle way. So there was definitely a falling away. Um, but I think again, it was as like my personality is such a nebulous word, but like as my personality kind of balanced itself out, there was a great falling away, I think, from maybe because my perspectives these days really aren't that extreme. Like they are definitely more balanced. Like there's more of a sense of balance, I think, in what I offer up there. And that's just like an honest reflection of where I am on the spiritual journey. And in terms of, I'll say the word publicity, which really necessarily means like a public awareness of the person, the entity, a public awareness of the entity, where the public awareness of the entity will kind of fade a little bit because there isn't that extreme aspect to attract, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah. And, you know, I think, what this is bringing up for me too is the sort of, like, there's wisdom in knowing when it's time to leave the hermit's cave, when it's time to leave the shadowscape. And when we don't ever leave it, then that's a whole ego story in itself.
Mhm.
And there's something there too about like how you're integrating the shadow. I know for you, it kind of began with the Morrigan kind of feeling like, oh, my phone reception to the Morrigan, it's getting a little staticky. She's not picking up as much. And there were some other elements, maybe your spiritual tools weren't calling you as much, like the literal like wands and brooms and crystals and everything. Was there sort of an epiphany moment within yourself where you realized like, oh, it's time to come into the light a little bit more, or did that just kind of happen naturally over time?
I think it definitely happened. It happened naturally over time. So there wasn't any singular event that convinced me that this was like where I needed to be. I do kind of remember when the shift, and you're talking about nature worship. So I there's like a bit of a dichotomy. Me in the light is like me in nature, just living and connecting in that way. And then me in the darkness is there's a lot of um props. I don't, like even when you think of like, spirituality in the summer versus spirituality in the winter, you're inside a lot more than you would be. You're not as connected with nature in that respect. So then more of the esoteric elements to your practice seem like almost more attractive because it's like what you have to work with, if that makes any sense. And it's fun, it's like something, but I think it was like it really was like 2 years ago where I realized that I wanted to feel better. And that in order for me to feel better, I was just going to have to let go of this aspect of my personality that had been so instrumental for such a long time and that I'd really, really identified with. You start to identify with your trauma after a while. You start to identify with those experiences and it becomes a part of your personality. And I knew that if I really wanted to move forward in terms of spiritual growth and development, I was just going to have to let that go. And I think that happened in April of 2 years ago. So
Mm.
April's like a big April, beginning of May, huge transformative time for me, usually. The beginning of the astrological year makes sense. But I remember going outside and I still had my Patreon then. Even I've even closed my Patreon because I realized having to create so much like something new every week was just stifling my ability to grow. And I felt like I was almost like regurgitating. It became something that I didn't feel was resonant or workable for me specifically any longer. But I went out to my favorite spot outside, and I just made this like video, like this vlog of nature, of me walking in the grass, of the sun through the clouds. And I realized that that's all my spirituality really needed to be. And that I felt the most profound connection, and still do to this day, just by like sitting in the grass. And that it didn't, for me to feel the connection, it didn't require the modalities that I'd been using before, and that it could be simpler. I could get the same sense of connection through this, just allowing myself to be in the world itself, and to kind of have like union in that experience. So like, and I made that vlog, and I offered it to my people. And it looked very different from the things that I'd been offering, but it also felt so much more like who I actually was naturally. And then, in really diving so deeply into my shadow, I discovered, and also just really, really giving myself over to spiritual practice and making it such a cornerstone of my life, that I had kind of repressed another aspect of myself, which is the self that just really enjoys reading, transcendental poetry in the grass, and then calling that spirituality, to be honest. And that's like my most natural form. And that I realized at that moment that that was what made sense, and that I no longer felt like I couldn't create in the same vein that I'd been creating, because it no longer felt like where it is that I was. So I continued to offer like all of my courses that were very much witchcraft focused for at least like another 2 years, till incredibly recently, because I realized that they could definitely serve people, but that I myself had changed. And if I continued to, and that my personality had become a persona, that didn't feel right. Like I could no longer go on playing that part, which it wasn't me playing a part before. It wasn't. And it's been very hard for me to kind of verbalize this to my own audience. Like that was who I was very much then. Like that wasn't a persona, right? Especially at the beginning. But there was a time there of cognitive dissonance where it became a persona, and that felt awful. Like I was still trying to be what I felt that my audience needed, or what they came here for, right? Still trying to offer what they'd showed up for, but it was no longer reflective of where it is that I was. So it felt really disingenuous. And I knew that I had to stop doing that, because it wasn't sustainable. Even if I had to like sacrifice my business in its form, which I kind of have, to be honest, like I had, because I also want, people who are going through this to know that like, your fears about losing things are not unfounded. And that's why a lot of people why they continue. And I get it, because there is loss in that. And then you have to rebuild again. But it was just what needed to happen for me. I couldn't continue to show up in the world in that way, in integrity and authenticity.
Yes, yeah. And now you're kind of making me think about, and this is no shade to any like witchy content creators or whatnot, but you are making me think like, some of like the really popular tarot readers like on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, who have the aesthetic or the sort of very curated Instagram profile or whatever curated YouTube playlist. Uh, are they acting within a persona? I think it's too much of a generality to say like everybody with a witchy aesthetic is acting in a persona, but there is something like a little bit intangible about that lifestyle that makes it all more intriguing to watch or view or whatnot. And I'm relating to what you're saying in the sense of like, as I've quote unquote healed and as I've integrated the shadow a little bit more, I've become less interested in content creation aesthetics as a whole. And I just truly don't have the energy for it. And you're totally correct. Like, does that make me money? No. Like, I would make more money probably if I was keeping up with a certain aesthetic or keeping up with a certain vibe. And instead, I'm presenting human version of Mao, who also does read tarot and has a genuine passion for astrology, but I don't have it in me mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually to keep up with some it's content situation, especially if Instagram's going to blow up one day, and we're never going to see it again, which is a very real possibility. I have a real issue with that. Like, I'm going to put all this work into curating something that doesn't feel 100% right to me, that's then going to disappear one day. Like, no, I don't know if you get that, like that sort of loss of interest in
Oh yeah.
the content creation in some way.
Oh yeah. I think that was part of it too, because for a while there, success can be a funny thing. Um, and especially if you can identify how it happened and do more of it. And I definitely was, because I do love beautiful things. I will admit, I love beauty. I'm not going to pretend that I don't, because that's one of the reasons why I deeply connect to nature. I'm just like, why is it so beautiful? Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. But there is this, if you are able to pull off the aesthetic, you will get more attention. And that is that, period.
Mhm.
And that also, it takes a lot of creative energy to do. So I actually kind of almost understand influencers specifically who have made that their artwork, who have made, and that's how, and they decide that that's how they're going to, generate an income, is through the creation of this visual feast that people keep showing up to look at. But for me, it was never, I always wanted my business to be services. I wanted it to be something different. I didn't want it to just be the content that I created specifically. But when I was doing it that way, I mean, I could, you look at analytics and you can see and just notice patterns and what works and what doesn't. And I started doing a little bit of experimentation to see how things were going to go. I'm an INFJ, so I'm all about recognizing the patterns, and I can't even help but recognize them. So I would play around with almost like with YouTube thumbnails, and I already knew which ones were going to garner the most views. If you'll notice now, my YouTube channel has just like the views have decreased significantly, because I was just like, I'm not just going to do what I know is going to get views. And
Yeah.
I had to make that conscious, and I was like, and I know it's going to tank it, and it did. So the reason people do this is because it works. And for me, again, doing what I knew was going to work, I was like, you know what? I can't do it, because it's not, because even I had just begun to feel so disconnected. And and this is something I spoke about maybe even 3 years ago in another interview, is like, you used to sit down in your sacred space and do what you're going to do. And then the more you begin to share, especially if you get really caught up in that aesthetic, that you sit down to sacred space and you're like, oh, I should take a picture of this. And then you start like, I think I was talking to Alvine Green. I don't know if you're familiar with her. It's like, oh, I should like, let me put my crystals like this, like, let me, the lighting's not quite right. So like, let me put the lighting on in this specific way, which is like fine if you're setting up to take a picture, but it's not really fine if you sat down to engage in spiritual practice. So that was another element of it that began to feel disingenuous to me. And I knew that that's what you had to do. The reason people do it is because you kind of have to in order to have, and again, I'm going to just take like exposure in order for people to show up, right? And so making the conscious choice to show up in the way that felt natural and good, I knew what I was doing. Like, I knew that I could be sacrificing everything that I'd built, which is why it took me so long to really make the transition, I think, because I invested so much time and energy into this, and it was my livelihood. And like, but honestly, letting go of that, inevitably, it gave me my creative verve. Like, I had been spending so much energy on that. I realized that all I wasn't making anything of substance, not what I really wanted to create or make. And I also knew I needed to sacrifice that so I could get some of the creative libido, which is like another way of saying like the energy, the drive, the motivation to create a work that I really wanted to create, which has become the Genius Garden Tarot. I don't think I ever would have been able to have the time, energy, or effort like that I needed to create that deck if I hadn't let go of the aesthetic of wanting to get engagement, wanting to get views. I knew it was a huge risk when I took it. It still feels like a huge risk, even as like I'm finishing it up and the Kickstarter campaign is like in its last days. I'm like, oh girl, what did you do? as I'm giving birth to this deck, and I'm like, in tears over what I've created and how excited other people are for it at the same time. So I don't regret it because it gave me what I needed to create something I've always wanted to create, a work. And in my mind, in my early ego mind, it was a great work. But as I've integrated, I was like, it doesn't need to be a great work. It just needs to be a work of genius, like of your personal, creative, divine. So I've been able to do that. So it was worth the exchange.
Oh gosh. And I definitely, I'm dying to ask you about the sort of creation of the Genius Garden Tarot in a moment, but I do want to just thank you for like saying all of that in the sort of sense of like the honesty of like, yeah, like I've lost followers, or like I've lost people who were keeping track of what I was doing. And I mean 100% same story with me. And so, I don't think I had as big of a intentional content shift as you've had, but I gotta say, if I really look at it, I got significantly more views when I was really struggling with like mental health stuff. And I mean, literally since I've kind of, this sounds so sick, but like, I mean, I've really done a lot with healing depression. Like I'm now on, meds, and I'm doing different things that feel really good. And since I haven't had a depressive episode in like 2 years, I've lost a lot of podcast listeners.
Yeah.
And like again, like is this like I mean, it's not necessarily misery loves company, but it's like the frequency of healing and, like you said, getting out of extremism and into a more neutral state. It's sometimes it's not appealing to social media. Like, the algorithm loves extremism, like you said. And oftentimes we do lose money as content creators when
Oh, yeah.
we're presenting the authenticity that everybody says they want, but not, so I just want to say thank you for saying that. And I don't think you and I are the only content creators who struggle with this.
Mhm.
And yeah, there is this sort of dissonance that I think every single spiritual being who puts their content out on YouTube, on Instagram, eventually you will come up against this dissonance of, I have now changed and transformed away from my original aesthetic that I was presenting. And now what do I do? Because people still like that aesthetic, but
Mhm.
I am no longer that. It's crazy.
It's crazy. It's incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
For me, the business journey has always been a huge aspect of the spiritual journey anyway. It will unearth so many shadows. It's
Oh, yeah.
it's amazing what you
That's
can learn from doing this about yourself.
that's what I tell my tarot students. If you really want to do shadow work, just start a business.
Yeah.
You don't even need to buy the cauldron and the wand.
No.
Just start a business, and your shadow self will be right in front of your
Yeah.
face.
All the time. It will bring your deepest insecurities to the fore constantly.
Yes,
In
yes.
which it's an opportunity for growth again, which is like another reason why I think people who do this and who do it publicly, they do have these shifts, because even in the doing of it, it's alchemizing that change, like it's becomes almost like a lifestyle.
I know. And
um
it sounds like too, like in sort of, it feels like you found a new muse in
mhm,
nature, or not really a new muse, but you've rediscovered something that really did speak to you, like the transcendental poets and just being with the nature spirits. Would you say, did the nature spirits give you the download of the new tarot deck, the Genius Garden tarot deck, or how did you come into this idea?
so I feel that there's the oversoul,
Yeah.
God, the all, whatever it is that you want to call it, the collective unconscious, so many different names for it that connects us all. And then I feel that then we have that personal connection that manifests itself through us, like the divine light that filters itself through our physical being and becomes, again, it's what I refer to as genius, and people can also refer to it as their soul. The reason I refer to it as genius specifically because of the, like, I believe it's Greek. I always, for some reason, I'm like, is it Greek or Roman? I'm going to say genius is Greek. And the original conception of genius, or like genius loci, is that like every single physical entity that exists has its own individual spirit. Okay. Even
I,
like places, people, specific doorways, like it has its own attendant spirit. And that means that like we too as beings have a genius, our own attendant spirit, which, in the Western world, I guess, in the Christian conception, can be referred to as almost like a guardian angel in a way. But that's not quite it. It's not quite it, because the genius also very much has our own attributes, or like reflects our own attributes. It's very much like personal and interlinked. And then as time went on, genius evolved to kind of represent this idea of like your personal brilliance, right? So when we think of genius, we think of someone who's particularly clever or intelligent. But I kind of take it back. Like I take it back a few incarnations, etymologically speaking. The genius is that like divine aspect of self that connects us with It's like it connects the physical human embodied self with the divine, and it is unique. It does have some of our attributes. And so I'd say that is what inspired me to create the Genius Garden Tarot. And I say that because like even like the gods of nature and the, the oversoul, they're creating, right? The world that we see. And they created us. And there's still this idea, and this is like, again, this is like a Christian idea, but all of these things overlap, that like God creates you in God's own image. There's this suggestion that because we are aware of ourselves in the way that we have like godlike abilities, that we can create and we can like be as gods on earth. And that's what I think kind of inspires art. We create art to be closer to the creative force of God and to kind of express that personally, which is why I think it's so beautiful. It's almost like we're honoring the creative force of all life by choosing to create something to add to it, and that's what I think powered the Genius Garden Tarot. And I've been really playing with this idea of genius for a really long time and thinking about it, and also thinking about the importance of the surrounding environment when it comes to allowing that divine embodiment to kind of present itself, and like a cultivation of our environment to help bring that forth, to kind of encourage that expression of self. And I think it's directly related again to doing shadow work and healing the shadow, because the shadow wants us to keep us very small, and sometimes it really wants to disconnect us from that. It doesn't always want us to recognize or realize that we are divine, that we are fine as we are, that who we show up to be is great, and not only just great, but also like divinely perfect. I don't mean like ego perfection, perfect in our imperfection. So that was really what I think, that force, that creative, the genius is the inner creative force. It's like the channeling of the creative force of the cosmos through individual expression. And I feel like that's, and you can also call it like a muse, but that's how I feel when I'm called to do something like that. The creation of the tarot deck was that I just was called to paint, and I started painting for like a week, like very deeply inspired. And I painted the first card, which was the Empress, and also kind of a unintentional self-portrait. And then once I saw it, I was like, oh, that's the Empress. And I'm like, oh, I'm making a tarot deck now. And it just kind of, there it was. And I know it's like people want there to be more to that story, but that's it.
No,
It's like, that wasn't planned really. Like I always thought I was conceptualizing an oracle deck in the past. Like I've always wanted to make a deck, but the timing was never right. And then when I wasn't trying to make a deck when this happened, it's like, oh, it's time now. I'm like, okay. And I just kind of went for it.
well, it's so funny because like Jessi 5 years ago would have been like thinking maybe, ooh, I'm gonna make a shadow working oracle deck.
Mm-hmm.
Or something along those lines, or like a Morrigan or oracle deck. And then it's like you let it go and you let this like your own genius speak through you. And it's like, oh, wait, the spirit of this deck is to kind of remind us of our own divinity
Mm-hmm.
and our own light.
Mm-hmm.
And how cool is that? Because a lot of the times we speak about our tarot decks as like tough teachers, like, ooh, this tarot deck really calls me out on my shit. Like I probably said that before. I've heard a lot of tarot content creators say things like that about certain decks that, help them sort of mirror their shadow side or whatever. But it feels like the spirit of this deck is inherently kind and something that might remind us of our light, or even remind us that there's a time to emerge from the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to put words in the tarot deck's mouth if that's possible, but that's kind of what I'm getting from your description of the energy of the deck.
Oh, absolutely. There's I feel there's a definite gentleness to the deck. And definitely it's figures in nature. And that was also, and not even like abundant, lush nature, but not barren either, just like vast expanses. Because I wanted there to be a clarity and a simplicity. And I find, again, I can't wait until people actually get the deck in their hand and start working with it, because I think its value will become apparent through working with it. It's hard to see that when you're just looking at it, that I designed each card to kind of draw you into a path working journey. When you create negative, when you include negative space in a card, it does that. And when you kind of strip the figures in the card down to their basic essence, it does that. You do not get distracted by detail. And that was very much my intention. I could have done something more elaborate, but I consciously chose not to. And I have kept like simplicity at the forefront in terms of the images that I've included in the deck, because I want clarity to be I don't necessarily want too much kind of whirling. I don't want people to be like, that symbol, that symbol, that symbol, that symbol, that symbol, that symbol. That is fun, and that is cool, and that is very much a way to read tarot. My intention was just, here's an image. Just look into it for a second and see, almost like scrying. I kind of did want like it to be a little bit of a scrying experience, almost more like a Rorschach. It's like, what do I feel? I wanted it to be simple in its expression, and I wanted it to be gentle symbol. I wanted you to come away from the reading feeling like, like almost like clarified. I don't want people to come away with the reading with a million questions. I wanted it to kind of just be that clarifying, to kind of jumpstart that clarifying experience. At least, again, that was my intention. The deck has not been produced as of yet. I still have, I guess, 6 more cards to do, which will not take me long. But then once those are finished, I can get production rolling. I'm really, really excited to see how other people experience it, because it still belongs to me too. I have like a dummy deck that's not completely finished that I've been working with for the past couple months, because I want to get a sense of how the deck reads. And so I'm the only one who knows what it reads like at this point and has any kind of opinion. I am excited to see what other people think. And it's been really interesting to also just see people's reactions just looking at it. People are like, oh, it's simple. And some people are like, well, it's not for me. And other people have been like, oh my gosh, I've been waiting for something like this. So it's like everyone has their own, it speaks to different people differently. And I think that that's really cool. I'm excited to see what it does out in the world.
I am too. And one, I know our time is kind of ticking here, but one question that I wanted to ask about the deck, and maybe in relation to this idea that the spirit of the deck may be calling in seekers who maybe are now in a chapter of their healing journey or their spiritual evolution, where maybe they've done the shadow work and now they're like, all right, maybe I've bought into my suffering too much, or maybe I've over identified with this sadness or this piece of grief. Not that those feelings are invalid at all. In fact, I think we need to work with those feelings, but
yes, it's necessary.
yes, but I'm thinking, like, for you, what advice or guidance do you have, slash what advice or guidance does your tarot deck kind of hold when it comes to maybe people saying something like, I'm in the shadow, but I'm feeling like it's time to emerge from the shadow, but I don't know how. Or like I'm struggling with how to find joy or find pleasure or kind of embrace the light after so long kind of hanging out in my shadow selves?
Mhm. This is a hard question to just be able to, it's usually a process. It's not like any one thing. Um, you have to stop identifying with your shadow,
Mm.
over identifying with your shadow. Recognize that it is an element of your journey, and that the power that it has is a power that you don't need to feed. There's something really tempting about hanging out in shadow. When you're hanging out in shadow, it's very easy to conceptualize yourself as someone who has been wronged, and which we've all been wronged, right? Like, again, you're saying it's a legitimate, like, I've been wronged, right? But if you can't really emerge from the shadow until you stop focusing on what's gone wrong, or who has wronged you, or what you perceive to be wrong about yourself. Like, there has to be that moment where you take the power back. As long as you see yourself as someone who has been wronged, or someone who is wrong, you have very little power.
Mm.
Or you give power to people, conditions, and circumstances, rather than yourself. And this is hard. And it's hard for me to verbalize this, because often people who aren't quite there yet don't want to hear this, or they hear it as a personal attack, or they hear it as, oh, you're completely denying the hardships that I've been through, or you're completely denying the trauma that I've gone through. It's heard as almost, oh, you think I should just, pick myself up by my bootstraps and move on, right? Where that's not really what's intended. What's intended is, I don't know who said this, and I'm paraphrasing here. It's like, what has happened to you is not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Doesn't that suck? You have to move to that point where you become responsible for healing yourself. And the thing is, the blame that you place on others, they probably deserve it. And that's where I think people get hung up. Just like, no, but they did that to me and that was awful. It's like, yes, you were deeply wronged and someone hurt you and you didn't deserve it. You're right. The unfortunate part is, if you don't take responsibility for healing the pain that someone else caused, it's almost like they're doing it to you over and over and over again. Every time you're triggered, that person's hurting you again. So you have to take responsibility for your own healing in order to completely move beyond, and to actually be in your own power and recognize that crappy things are always going to happen throughout your life. People are going to betray you. People you love are going to totally and completely misunderstand you in ways that cut you to the quick. These things are going to continue happening. And to climb out of the shadow, you have to develop an inner strength and a sense of compassion and a sense of understanding of yourself and others that allows you to move on despite that. That's really what needs to happen. And say, okay, all this stuff that happened isn't my fault, but I'm the only person who can fix it. So let's fix it. And the healing, the shadow work, a really intense period of shadow work is almost like the beginning of the healing journey. And mistaking shadow work for healing will keep you stuck, I think.
Oh, big. Yeah, because if you just go to therapy and forget to do the dance class that really lights you up,
Mhm.
therapy doesn't have as big of an effect
Mhm.
because you're forgetting the other side of it, And also, can I just say what you just described? I was seeing the Five of Swords in the tarot, and I was like, that's a really good way to conceptualize the Five of Swords. So I just want
Mhm.
to know that card popped into my mind as you were giving the answer. But yeah, I think you know what you said really speaks to part of my healing too, which is like, where have I been over identifying with this or that, and how do I rewrite the story, which is a lot of what we've done publicly. Has everybody liked it? No, but
No,
but we're
no.
writing the story. Well, Jessi, I want to give you some space to talk about the Kickstarter for Genius Garden. But I also wanted to, if you feel comfortable, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you want to do a little card pull for sort of a
Yes.
okay, an extra layer of reflection on our theme today as a sort of ending point?
Sure. Do you want me to pull a card?
Yeah, yeah, maybe
Okay.
from
Oh
the
my
G.
gosh. There's the deck. Hold on. Okay. Had to go grab my deck. It was in sacred space. I also just wanted to say, when you said that made you think of the Five of Swords, in this deck, the figure actually is holding, in the Genius Garden Tarot, the figure is holding the sword point toward their chin. And then
Oh,
there's a figure in the back with the rest of the swords on a mountain, like grieving their deaths. So like the person in the back grieving has like begun the process of healing, and the person in the forefront is just holding the tip to their chin and like just continuing to generate that kind of suffering.
wow. That's so powerful.
Ooh, I'm gonna pull a card. Oh, do you know what card just popped up? The death card.
Oh my gosh. And we've been talking about death this entire time. So this is amazing.
And this is actually one of the cards that I think perfectly illustrates it. I use it in the text and the Kickstarter campaign to kind of illustrate what this deck really accentuates, and there like that hopefulness and resiliency through struggle. So usually in the RWS, or Rider-Waite-Smith version of the tarot, you see death riding a dark horse, and there's very much a grim reaper element to the depiction, and this idea that death comes for all men or all people. That it doesn't matter if you're in the highest position or the lowest, if you have a lot or you have very little, it's the great equalizer. And in this deck particularly, we see actual like lava fields. I don't know if you can, trying to make it so you can see
Yeah.
smoke rising from the cracks in the lava fields, and then there is one little shoot, green shoot coming up through the lava to kind of allow that connection. Like without death, there is no rebirth. And when one thing falls away, it necessarily paves the way for something else, because that's just a cosmic law. In terms of the universe that we live in, things are created and things are destroyed infinitely, according to our understanding. So I very much wanted the death card to include that element, that it's not just that in death, there is the seed of rebirth. And that when you feel something falling away, as in the case of spiritual evolution, you're in the midst of that transformation, it can be really challenging. But if you remember that in this actual falling away and in this actual death that you're experiencing, it includes the seed of rebirth cosmically, that can be what you hold on to get you through the dark night of that transformation.
Mm, yeah, that's juicy. I love the lava metaphor too, this sort of like the volcano erupts and destroys, and then the lava creates
Mhm.
foundation Yeah.
Very fertile soil.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad we got a little sneak peek of the Genius Garden Tarot. And Jessi, your Kickstarter is live until May 9th, 2020.
Yes.
Does that
Until May 9th, 2023. Oh, it's 11:11 right now. Sorry, I like just looked at my clock to see the date and I'm like, oh, 11:11. But angel numbers. But so the Kickstarter is live until noon on, or no, 10 a.m., I believe, May 9th. So there's 12, actually probably 11 technically now, what time it is. There's 11 days left in the Kickstarter. So where we are right now, we're very close. So I'm excited. But yeah, and it's also going to be, if you're like coming to this later as well, it's definitely going to be available for pre-order too. So even if you're like listening to us chat and you're like, oh, that's already passed, it's still available. If you're listening to this now and you're interested, feel free to check out the link, or even you can say Genius Garden Tarot Kickstarter, and it will pop up. And you'll be able to find out more about the deck, about my intentions for it, about how and why it was created. And it's really exciting. So if you choose to go check it out, thank you so much in advance. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, totally. And I'll of course have all of your info in the show notes, your YouTube channel. I know you've been doing some tarot scopes with the Genius Garden Tarot. So if any of the listeners are interested in getting that visual of what the deck looks like, check out those tarot scopes. We'll have the link to the Kickstarter in the show notes. And yeah, it's just been such a pleasure. And I love how I'm pretty sure our last interview was about shadow work. So I love how this has evolved in just the strangest but most beautiful way. And one more thing I wanted to mention too, like I just wrote a astrology article about Walt Whitman, who has a lot of Gemini placements, and I know you're a Gemini moon. And he says, we're full of contradictions, or and it reminds me of a lot of the things that you talked about with holding space for our multitudes.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your evolution with such honesty. It's helped me, so you helped one.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and for inviting me to speak about this. I mentioned, before we started the interview to you, that this is actually not the easiest thing to speak about because it makes me vulnerable, but I've really relished the opportunity to be able to honestly share. So thank you for making that possible and for being so inviting and holding space for that.
Oh, I'm in it. All right. Well, thanks, Jessi, and we'll talk to you guys next time.